I recently published a fully referenced investigative report to take readers on a guided tour of the pandemic using the government's own official numbers, presented with the context that the government has denied the public during the chaos of the last 15 months. What emerged was a shocking story of scientific misconduct and breach of trust, which revealed the horrifying and deadly consequences of stripping data of context and allowing the government to evade transparency. This abbreviated video version guides you through some of the key takeaways using a series of 34 charts and images. Let it spark your curiosity. The real meat of the scandals will be waiting for you in the full-length report. I've put a link in the video description below. But before I get started, head over to my website and sign up for free email notifications to receive my latest articles in your inbox. And if you'd like to support my independent writing, please consider donating to my tip jar. Throughout the pandemic, the government has systematically misrepresented the risk to Canadians by providing out-of-context numbers. For example, on April 19th, Dr. Bonnie Henry used the death of an infant in BC to tell Canadians that it reminds us of the vicious nature of this virus. Yet this was the very first death in anyone in BC under the age of 30, more than a year and 2 full waves into the pandemic. And it was a child that had such severe pre-existing conditions that it was already a patient seeking out specialized care at the BC Children's Hospital before catching COVID. And it caught the virus inside the hospital, not out in the community. It should have reminded Canadians just how not dangerous this virus is to young people under the age of 30. By withholding important context, by using extremely fear-inducing language, and by de-emphasizing the most important parts of the story, Dr. Henry succeeded in telling exactly the opposite story told by the facts. She hijacked this infant's tragic death to craft a public message that is simply not supported by the government's own data, a lie created without actually falsifying any data. Magicians call this the art of misdirection, using fancy cues that naturally attract the public's eye in order to distract from that which the magician doesn't want you to see. To add additional context to Dr. Henry's propaganda message, in Canada an average of 25 children aged 0 to 19 die of influenza and pneumonia every single year, whereas as of May 7th, 15 months into the pandemic, COVID had claimed 11 children's lives in all of Canada. The government recently released a report of all 13,789 deaths linked to outbreaks in Canada. An outbreak is defined as occurring at any time 2 or more infections are linked to a single location or event. This outbreak data set starts to put some context to the individual risk that we each face from this virus. 98.6% of all outbreak-linked deaths are from infections caught inside government-controlled or government-regulated institutional settings, long-term care, hospitals, and prisons. These are people who live, permanently or temporarily, in government-controlled institutions or in privately owned but government-regulated facilities like nursing homes. They don't go home at night. They only get to mingle with us when the government chooses to let us through their institutional door. Only 1.4% of outbreak-linked deaths are from infections caught outside of these institutional walls. Thus, if the government were to permanently board up every small business, school, nail salon, gym, and church, the other 98.6% of outbreak-linked deaths happening under the government's watchful care would still continue. Even if every single Canadian living outside of one of these settings was locked up in a quarry and the key was thrown away, 98.6% of outbreak-linked deaths would continue as long as the government keeps making the same idiotic mistakes the way it is managing life behind institutional walls. 13,611 versus 178. Those are the hard numbers illustrating the differences of what is occurring on either side of that institutional divide. The pie chart demonstrates that this is a crisis that is almost exclusively affecting people living with extremely serious pre-existing health conditions and compromised immune systems, and almost no one else. The outbreak data is even more remarkable when you put some numbers to the sizes of the populations living in each of these two settings. Let's focus on the elderly, those who we already have been told are the most vulnerable to this virus. There are roughly 292,000 people living inside institutional settings where the 98.6% of outbreak-linked deaths occurred. That's 13,611 deaths in a population of 292,000 people. By contrast, there are at least 9.1 million elderly, including approximately 6.8 million elderly with multiple chronic conditions that are living outside of these institutional settings, many of whom are every bit as vulnerable as the patients inside nursing homes. Yet at most 178 outbreak-linked deaths occurred among this vast population. Just as remarkable is the fact that over 14.5 million people traveled into Canada since the pandemic began, including the millions of Canadians crammed together inside border controls in March of 2020, when the government asked Canadians to all come home from abroad at once. Yet those 14.5 million travelers didn't even warrant their own category as an outbreak setting. Yet the tiny population of 292,000 institutionalized citizens under the government's watchful care managed to produce 98.6% of the outbreak-linked deaths. Context is everything. This is a major red flag that the fearful beliefs encouraged by our health officials about the behavior of this virus are entirely out of sync with the story told by the government's own data. The difference in risk between those who live in institutionalized settings versus those who do not is simply mind-bogglingly enormous. One-size-fits-all policy-making is ridiculous when different demographics have such different levels of risk, particularly since those who are most vulnerable are already living with such severe pre-existing conditions that they are easy to identify and protect behind shuttered doors by providing focused protection. Let's include the rest of Canadian deaths not related to outbreaks to see how much the picture changes. Using public data released by the Government of Canada, we see that 75% of the 24,402 deaths in Canada as of May 7, 2021, were all from infections caught behind institutional walls. That's long-term care, hospitals, and prisons. 75% of all Canadian deaths are in the tiny population of approximately 292,000 that you're already familiar with. Meanwhile, although there are 38 million Canadians living outside of institutional walls, including more than 6.8 million elderly with pre-existing health conditions, only 25% of all deaths in Canada occurred in this vast population. This chart puts this into perspective. Clearly, COVID is dangerous to those who have severe pre-existing health conditions, but that danger is magnified many times if their front doors are controlled by the government. For the rest of us, including the vulnerable living with pre-existing conditions but who guard their own front doors, not so much. This summary from the WHO's 2019 Pandemic Planning Guidelines shows which health measures are recommended depending on the severity of a pandemic, and which measures should never be recommended under any circumstances. Study this list carefully. It's of great importance to the scandals that come next. You'll notice that many of the public health measures were clearly a violation of long-established pandemic planning guidelines. Measures like contact tracing, quarantine of exposed but asymptomatic individuals, entry and exit screening into buildings, and border closures should never have been used. Others were measures that are only appropriate to extremely severe pandemics, the highest level on the scale. Are 24,402 deaths a lot? Were these measures warranted? You be the judge. Here's a chart from Statistics Canada showing the total annual deaths from all causes in a year-over-year comparison. The blue column covers the first full year of the pandemic. COVID does not stand out above the trend of previous bad flu seasons. Here's another chart produced with data from Statistics Canada, a comparison of 5 years of death in Canada, organized by cause of death. It's rather clear that unless COVID cures cancer and heart attacks, a lot of COVID deaths were misattributed or occurred among people in the very last few weeks or months of their life. This inflation of COVID numbers caused by counting all deaths with a positive PCR test, regardless of whether the patient actually died with or from COVID, is well known and even acknowledged by public health officials, despite keeping our eyeballs fixated on cases. This screen grab shows Toronto Public Health acknowledging the issue. The distorted reality you have been given in the news is not an accident. They know the numbers are inflated, and they keep doing it anyway. This chart uses data from Statistics Canada to show deaths week by week from all causes over the past 11 years. The normal seasonal variations in death caused by flu seasons are clearly visible. So are both COVID waves number 1 and number 2. The first wave from the winter of 2019-2020 was equivalent to a bad flu season, similar to the 2017-2018 season. The second wave from the winter of 2020-2021 was barely equivalent to a moderate flu season. There's nothing here to suggest that we are living through a once-in-a-generation pandemic. The seasonality of coronaviruses is well documented, including by our own government. COVID follows the exact same seasonal variation as the other 4 coronaviruses that have long since been part of the regular concoction of viruses that cause colds and flus in Canada every winter. Yet as spring weather returns, health officials have tried to give credit to their lockdowns for the falling cases. This chart was published by the Government of Ontario showing coronavirus seasonality during previous years. Those are the grey, orange, and navy blue lines on the chart. As you can see, COVID is following the exact same trajectory as other coronaviruses do. The black curve shows COVID arriving midway through the 2019-2020 winter flu season. The dark blue line ending at week 46 shows the beginning of the 2020-2021 winter flu season, up to when the government data runs out. It's important to remember that this is the government that put the COVID data on this chart, not me. They know COVID is seasonal. Yet they still try to give lockdowns credit for the drop in cases that happens in the spring. Giving lockdowns credit for a drop in cases in the spring is like taking credit for the sun rising in the east. It's another lie created by stripping data of its context. Here's Dr. Tam doing just that. She says that in just over a month, the number of reported active cases has decreased by 31%. You did that, Canada. Bravo, let's keep it up. No, Dr. Tam, seasonality did that. You are legitimizing lockdowns using the magician's art of misdirection. Lockdowns were a fantasy. Here is what lockdowns were meant to do with their promise of flattening the curve. But the previous charts clearly demonstrate that virus activity is seasonal. You can't flatten the curve. Seasonality means that lockdowns can merely blunt each peak, thus transferring the nightmare of never-ending COVID to the next winter season, and the next, until enough of the population finally achieves herd immunity to create a protective ring around the vulnerable living in the community. Instead of opting for 6 to 8 weeks of focused protection for the vulnerable, our health officials artificially created the conditions for this 15-month nightmare, and it's not over yet. Thanks to lockdowns, which prevented the healthy from achieving herd immunity, the vulnerable are still every bit as much at risk as they were 15 months ago. It's a well-known fact that half of all long-term care residents live less than 5 months once they enter long-term care. They are going there because they're on the threshold of dying. They don't have time for a year-long knockdown. So 3 separate crops of long-term care patients have come and gone since COVID began. Yet there is still no safety to be found inside these institutions because the virus still hasn't been allowed to burn itself out outside in the community. Lockdowns have stretched out the forced confinement for so long that many of these patients have been robbed of the last precious months with family members and were left to face death in isolation, without the dignity and comfort of being surrounded by loved ones during their most difficult last weeks and months. It breaks my heart. Some, like 90-year-old Nancy Russell, chose euthanasia rather than face the isolation of another lockdown. The implications of this failed lockdown strategy are huge. Let's revisit the very first chart in this video showing the 2 waves of dying created by virus seasonality. If health officials had provided focused protection for the vulnerable during the first wave, as called for by the WHO pandemic planning guidelines, and had allowed the rest of society to acquire natural herd immunity, as it does every winter flu season, a very large portion of the deaths in the second wave would have been prevented because herd immunity among the healthy would have caused this virus to burn itself out long before the second wave started. Blatantly ignoring pandemic planning guidelines, which were written specifically to prevent this kind of DIY rulemaking, is gross criminal negligence. The public didn't know in advance, but every single health official did. It's their job to know. Pandemic planning guidelines were written specifically to guide their decision-making in the heat of a crisis. The last defense against government overreach, which should have at least prevented health officials from making public health measures mandatory, are our constitutional rights and freedoms. Section 1 of our charter is an obligation on our government to present evidence and face critics in a court of law before imposing any limits on citizens' rights and freedoms. This never happened. Our charter was systematically ignored. It is illegal to strip anyone of their rights and freedoms without passing this formal legal test. Lockdowns are thus a human rights violation, and they clearly have caused deaths, both among the vulnerable and as a result of collateral damage caused by the lockdowns themselves, such as suicides, cancelled cancer treatments, a huge surge in overdoses, and so on. So we have 2 serious failures here. We have a failure of democracy to use debate and evidence to justify itself in the public square before infringing on our rights. And we have a gross failure in our legal system and in our courts to defend our rights, which would have prevented these misbegotten public health measures from being imposed in the first place. Our health officials and politicians, along with many of the judges, systematically prevented legal challenges of the lockdowns, so they can all look forward to a date with a human rights tribunal when this hysteria ends. It's one thing to be swept up by mass hysteria. It's quite another to knowingly play chess with the truth and gamble with other people's lives in order to intentionally fuel hysteria to engineer some alleged greater good. The intentional use of fear to control public behavior and the willful disdain of evidence and scientific debate, as well as the reckless disregard for established pandemic planning protocols, have collectively contributed to many more preventable deaths, on top of the preventable Wave 2 deaths caused by the lockdown strategy. Many of the deaths during the first wave were also preventable if the pandemic planning guidelines had been followed. The out-of-proportion fear whipped up by health officials and the shortage of personal protective equipment that resulted from that fear led to many entirely preventable deaths among nursing home patients because many frightened healthcare workers abandoned their patients in nursing homes out of fear for themselves and their own families. This is a phenomenon that happened in many countries. The army had to be called in Quebec because so many care home staff fled their jobs that abandoned residents were quite literally dying in their beds because of neglect. Before the pandemic even arrived in Canada, Dr. Tam warned that the epidemic of fear could be more difficult to control than the epidemic itself. Yet then she drove much of the fear herself through her own public messaging. One of the worst has been the recommendation to wear face masks. The default attitude when randomized controlled trials don't show any evidence of masks working to stop respiratory viruses is to create policies that err on the side of them not working, not to assume that they do. This excerpt was taken directly from the WHO's 2019 pandemic planning guidelines. When the virus first arrived, health officials initially correctly explained that masks don't work, while also telling the public that they were needed for healthcare workers. While that's also true, they did a terrible job of explaining why. It's to protect healthcare workers from larger particles like bacteria, as well as to protect them from splashes of body fluids while working closely with patients, urine, phlegm, that kind of stuff. They need them, but not for protection against viruses. The mixed messaging just fueled the public's feeling that they were being lied to and gave them the sense that the virus was actually much more dangerous than officials were admitting. And so the public latched onto masks even harder, and many healthcare workers working in long-term care got caught up in the same panic when mask shortages started cropping up, which contributed to many of them abandoning their patients in nursing homes. Instead of fixing the public messaging, the government instead gave in to the public's demands for masks, thus turning over policy making to the frightened public. They confirmed the public's worst fears by switching to mask recommendations, without producing any evidence to overturn decades of randomized trials showing that they don't work for respiratory viruses. They also fell head over heels in love with HEPA filters, despite the fact that hospitals know that HEPA filters are not capable of reliably removing viral particles. Aerosol-producing patients must be isolated in negative pressure rooms to prevent spread. But worst of all, the government appears to have believed its own bullshit and created policies to protect the vulnerable in nursing homes using these ineffective tools like face masks and air filtration, instead of using ventilation and focused protection. And their sudden unscientific faith in masks and HEPA filters led the government to begin transferring COVID-infected patients into nursing homes where the most vulnerable are all just sitting ducks once the virus gets inside. In other words, the government introduced the virus into the living spaces of our most vulnerable citizens, and then expected a placebo, face masks and HEPA filters, to prevent spread through contaminated airspaces and heating ducts. It was a death trap for many of our most vulnerable long-term care residents. That's gross negligence of criminal proportions. In Quebec alone, that decision cost up to 6,700 lives, a quarter of all COVID deaths in Canada. Thousands of deaths during the first wave could have been prevented if the government officials had not abandoned scientific research that was cited in the pandemic planning protocols. Thousands more could have been prevented by stopping all cross-traffic of staff between nursing homes and by sealing staff inside nursing homes with their patients until the wave passed outside their doors. But why worry? They're all wearing face masks, right? Health officials literally turn their backs on decades of scientific research while telling us to trust the science. Instead of focusing on their job, to protect the vulnerable, they focused all their efforts on preventing us from eating a meal at a restaurant, intimidating pastors, placing illegal limits on protest attendance, and tormenting our school children with pointless masks, social distancing, and school closures. Remember that peaceful protest, without attendance limits, is a guaranteed charter right. It's a tool of last resort in a democracy to give citizens a voice when all other methods of dialogue fail. There are two ways to protect the vulnerable. The option that is at the heart of pandemic planning guidelines is to provide focused protection for the vulnerable while allowing the healthy members of the community to acquire herd immunity through natural exposure to the virus during the 6 to 8 week pandemic wave. Unless there are lockdowns to slow the spread, after that typical 6 to 8 week wave, enough members of the general public have immunity to create a protective ring of immune people around the pockets of the vulnerable. The virus essentially dries up outside their doors, so they can rejoin the rest of society in normal life without having to face the risk of catching the virus themselves. Instead, health officials used lockdowns to put all their faith in the distant hope of vaccines as their exit strategy. The vulnerable, both inside and outside institutional walls, have therefore been at risk for more than 15 months while society waited for these miracle vaccines to emerge. The vaccine thus becomes the deadliest vaccine in history, even before the very first jab was given, because the vulnerable kept on dying through an entire second wave while society waited for a vaccine. And this vaccine strategy was an extremely reckless gamble, because there was never a guarantee that a safe vaccine could be developed. We still don't know if it's safe, despite being in rollout, because the Emergency-Use Authorization means that we still don't have long-term safety data. Long-term trials finish in 2024. It took almost a year for the narcolepsy that plagued the 2009 H1N1 vaccine rollout in Europe to emerge. Long-term trials matter. We are the experiment. This obsession with vaccines to the exclusion of everything else does not require vaccinating everyone. Once vaccines became available, all those who wanted, including every single vulnerable individual, can acquire individual protection through the point of a needle. Once vaccinated, it becomes irrelevant whether their neighbors, their children, or their waitress has it. As I have clearly shown in this report, the vulnerable during this pandemic are old with pre-existing health conditions, not babies too young to be immunized. As long as individual vaccination is available, a ring of immunity created through mass vaccination is not required to protect the vulnerable from COVID. Yet the obsession with vaccines has reached such a frenzy that we are making reopening conditional on vaccination. Coercion is being used to get people to comply with this entirely irrational mass vaccination program. Using coercion to make people get a medical intervention is a violation of our charter rights, and a clear violation of the Nuremberg Code. Vaccination is a sort of insurance policy. You take on one risk, however small, like that of a vaccination, and use it to offset another risk, like the risk of catching the disease. Every vaccine must be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. In a free and democratic society, vaccination is an individual choice that must always be free of coercion. In a free and open democratic society, transparency and open debate is both the key to change minds and is also the way that critics can bring legitimate concerns to the public's attention. If there is coercion, or when that transparency fails, or when the debate is suppressed, informed consent is not possible. No vaccine is entirely absent of risk, including long-established vaccines like those for measles, tetanus, or polio. The risks of those long-established vaccines are small and clearly known, while the risk of death if you catch one of the deadly diseases is also clearly known and well established. So the risk-reward equation is fairly easy to assess. That can't be said for the COVID vaccines. The fear and absence of context cultivated by the government over the past 15 months means that people do not have the necessary information to understand their personal risk from the virus. Consent given without a clear understanding of your personal risk and in the presence of coercion is not legitimate consent. It's a violation of the Nuremberg Code. Informed consent also requires the patient getting vaccinated to fully understand all safety issues related to the vaccination. The obsession with vaccines as an exit strategy has become so severe that health officials are minimizing and deflecting from the fact that long-term trials have not been completed, which makes us all guinea pigs in an experiment. and the clearly documented injuries, permanent disabilities, and deaths recorded on the US government's Vaccine Adverse Event Recording System are being downplayed. Critics and concerned doctors who try to engage in public discussion about them are vilified as conspiracy theorists. These deaths are real. People deserve to understand the risks they are taking in order to weigh them against their personal risk from the virus. It's a necessary ingredient for informed consent. And it's important to bear in mind that not a single vaccine-linked death would have happened if health officials had followed the pandemic planning guidelines and not put us in lockdowns. These unnecessary deaths are on top of all the other deaths that they've already caused. Furthermore, those who have already had the disease do not need vaccination because they have no risk to offset. As I highlighted in the opening section of the Nuremberg Code, informed consent is not possible for those who get no benefit from the vaccination. Those who have already been exposed to an infection already have immunity. So it's illegal, as per the principles of the Nuremberg Code, to expose these people to the risks of vaccination, however small they may be, when they get zero personal benefit from the vaccine. Already as early as October 2020, before the second wave, the WHO estimated that over 750 million people had been infected worldwide, and there are large portions of the population that already have cross-reactive immunity from exposure to other coronaviruses, up to 80% of us based on a study from Germany. None of these people need vaccinations, so it's illegal, as per the principles of the Nuremberg Code, to expose these people to the risks of vaccination because they have absolutely no risk to offset. The obsession with this vaccine has reached such a fever that we're even rolling out the vaccine to children and young adults, which I've demonstrated have almost zero statistical risk from this virus. They are being exposed to a vaccine with small but known risks, and risks that we do not know about yet because the long-term side effects are not known. This is the height of irresponsibility and medical misconduct. Bear in mind that, as Dr. Bonnie Henry's propaganda story showed, as of April 19th, not a single person in British Columbia under the age of 30 without severe pre-existing health conditions had died of COVID. So, a single vaccine-linked death in BC in anyone under the age of 30 who doesn't already have pre-existing medical conditions would make the vaccine more dangerous to under 30s than the virus itself. Health officials are even bypassing the principle of parental consent for children in order to get more jabs into arms, to use Doug Ford's ineloquent phrasing. The principle of parental consent is a fundamental principle in a free and open democratic society, which makes the parent and not the government the guardian of their children, and ensures that children have an advocate with their best interests at heart to protect them from their immature impulses, peer pressure, lack of fully matured long-term thinking, and from coercive pressure from health authorities and teachers. This principle has been discarded without any public consultation or input through democratic votes. It's been imposed. And the immunization records of any child that gives their consent for vaccination will not be shared with the parent or guardian unless the child wants to share it. Respect for individual liberties is the fundamental building block in a free and open society. Liberty is the origin of the word liberal in liberal democracy. That respect was completely swept away by lockdowns, and now our government is further jeopardizing our individual autonomy by threatening digital vaccine passports. This would create a two-tier society and would, in effect, lay the foundation for a Chinese-style social credit score system that allows the government to turn on or turn off access to your normal life, depending on whether some bureaucrat thinks you're being a good little boy or girl. Under the guise of health and safety, we're in the process of sweeping away all the long-standing principles and checks and balances of a democratic society. This is a threat to democracy itself. The obsession with vaccines has even reached the point where other promising treatment options, like Ivermectin, are being systematically blocked by government red tape, despite dozens of peer-reviewed trials that show promise of being every bit as effective as vaccines, both as a treatment option and for preventative use. Ivermectin, for example, is an out-of-patent repurposed drug, priced around $7 a dose, with clearly known short and long-term side effects. It's on the WHO's list of essential medicines, yet it's being withheld for safety reasons, while vaccines with no completed long-term trials and many questions about their safety are being rolled out en masse. Unlike the vaccines, there is no uncertainty about ivermectin's safety. The only question that needs an answer is whether it works. It raises the question whether the obsession with the vaccine as an exit strategy is forcing health officials to block alternatives because the Emergency-Use Authorization is only allowed if no other alternatives are available. These are not the actions of a government serving the people in a free and open democratic society. Politics and special interests appear to be taking priority over doing everything we can to keep you safe. There are many additional layers of scandal exposed in my full investigative report, but this gives you a taste of the path that I've cleared through the chaos of the last 15 months. Please share this report widely with everyone you know. This nightmare world of fabricated lies only ends when communities stand up together and say, enough. This adventure in DIY pandemic management has to stop. This despicable game of deception, fear-mongering, and misrepresentation of risk has to end. It's never too late to do the right thing. The pandemic planning guidelines tell us in no uncertain terms what needs to be done. Everything we've witnessed over the past 15 months signals that our scientific institutions, and many of those inside of them, have abandoned all the core principles that make science work. A functioning democracy is rooted in accountability, transparency, honest debate, and respect for individual rights. That too has been entirely absent during the last 15 months. The behaviour of our politicians, journalists, health officials, and many of the scientists advising them has had far more in common with the slander, smear, shaming, and cancel culture tactics of an out-of-control kindergarten than with the distinguished forebears of their professions upon whose shoulders they stand. They have knowingly played chess with the truth and gambled with people's lives in order to intentionally fuel hysteria to engineer some alleged greater good. It's the height of hubris to be so certain of the righteousness of their cause that even the truth was merely an obstacle in their path. These are not the actions of people with real empathy for their fellow citizens and an honest commitment to objective truth. Their patronizing lies of good intentions reveal the extent to which they view us as cattle to be herded into compliance, and not as fellow equals in a free and open society. They have become a threat to democracy itself. The most horrendous crimes are often well hidden in a fog of confusion, disguised from its victims behind a shroud of good intentions and noble ideals. What has happened over the past 15 months is the inevitable consequence of individuals operating in the absence of limits because a permissive society, driven into a frenzy of fear, has exempted these monsters from transparency, debate, and checks and balances. Science and democracy are those limits. They are the processes that keep our darkest illiberal impulses in check. The past 15 months gave us a window into what the pre-Enlightenment worldview looks like, with modern technology at its fingertips, and without the checks and balances imposed by scientific inquiry and liberal democracy. So it's time to hold these monsters to account, not only in pursuit of justice for those they've hurt or killed through their reckless gross negligence, but also to pull back the curtain to show society the illiberal world that it's been sleepwalking into. I'm going to end this report with the face of Nancy Russell. She chose to end her life through euthanasia, rather than to endure the forced isolation of a second lockdown. Never forget. I've placed a link in the description below so you can explore the full report. I've barely scratched the surface in this brief video. If you found this investigative report useful, please consider leaving a little something in my tip jar to support my independent writing. And make sure you subscribe to my channel for future videos. And remember to head over to my website to subscribe to my free email notifications so you don't miss any of my articles that don't make it to video. Thanks for watching.